The start of World War II in the Pacific can be dated precisely to the 7th of December, 1941. Early that morning, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the home of the United States Pacific Fleet. From that day on, the Pacific was engulfed by war for 4 horrifically bloody years at the cost of millions of lives. In this Globetrotter special, Ian Wright, Megan McCormick, Matt Young, and I, Zay Harding, visit key Pacific War locations in some of the world's remotest and most beautiful places. From Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, we travel to Kanchanaburi in Thailand and to Kokoda and Rabaul in Papua New Guinea. Heading on to the far-flung islands of Palau, Chuuk, Mili, and Saipan, we end our trip in Okinawa and Nagasaki, Japan. Our journey starts at Pearl Harbor. Megan McCormick attends the Remembrance Day held each December 7th to honor those who died in the unprovoked attack.
At 7:55 in the morning, Pearl Harbor was hit. Within minutes, the USS Arizona went down in flames, trapping 1,177 men beneath the surface. 20 U.S. ships were seriously damaged or sunk, along with 347 aircraft. More than 2,500 people were killed in the attack.
About to visit the final resting place of the crew of the USS Arizona, considered by many to be sacred ground.
It's a bit eerie to be standing above the spot where so many men drowned, and to imagine that this is the place where the bombs dropped that changed the entire course of the war.
One bomb hit when I happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I had my right ankle shot open. I had a chip of bone out of the right leg. Something went through my right thigh and out my rear. I had 5 pieces of shrapnel in the left leg. I had a 6 by 8 inch piece torn out of the left thigh. I had my right hand shot open. I lost part of my left elbow. I lost part of the left bicep. You know, we were just kids doing a job.
No hard feelings.
No. We haven't had any hard feelings against those fellas for years.
It was such an outstanding, heroic moment, isn't it?
They were doing what they were supposed to do, and we were doing what we were supposed to do.
This battle became
It's the politicians' fault.
Despite the shock of the attack, Pearl Harbor was less of a disaster for the USA than it might have been. Although lots of warships were sunk, its crucial aircraft carriers were luckily out of port that morning and survived to fight another day. The significance of this, though, would not become apparent for another 6 months. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese launched attacks throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Within 6 months, Guam, Hong Kong, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Singapore, French Indochina, Thailand, and Burma had all been captured in a brilliantly executed military campaign. To supply their troops in Burma on the front line of their expanding empire, the Japanese decided they needed to build a new railway line from Thailand. Connecting existing track in the two countries, it ran via Kanchanaburi through around 250 miles of jungle, taking nearly 18 months to build from June 1942 to October 1943. Against all the usual rules of war, the Japanese got prisoners of war to build it. So many died, it became known as the Death Railway. To find out more, I traveled to Thailand. The best-known feature of the so-called Death Railway is located here in the small town of Kanchanaburi. It's one of the most famous World War II sites in all of the Pacific, the bridge over the River Kwai. The river was the first major obstacle the railway line had to cross on its long journey to Burma. 3,500 prisoners of war were put to work on the bridge, which took nearly a year to build. Today, the bridge looks almost exactly as it did during the war, with one main difference. During one of the many bombing raids on the bridge, it was hit where these two square sections are. So these are actually post-war replacements for two curved sections which originally ran the whole length of the bridge. These days, the bridge over the River Kwai is a very popular tourist destination. Many simply walk over the bridge, but you can also take a trip across on one of the local trains. Despite being by far the best-known location on the Death Railway, actually only a handful of POWs died whilst building the bridge. The vast majority of those who died lost their lives further up the line. To find out more, I've joined up with Andrew Snow, a local resident who first came to Thailand to retrace the footsteps of his father, who was one of the POWs forced to work on the railway. Is this the section your dad worked on then?
No, he was a bit further up, a place called Tonchen South. There was a number of bridges, a number of cuttings, embankments to be built there. The camp is just above what's called Sayok Noi Waterfall.
So would your dad have actually ridden the train to get up to where he was?
Yes, the group that my father came with came by train up as far as a station called Wang Yai, and then from there they walked 6-7 kilometres to Tonchen South. A lot of the other men were not so lucky and walked for weeks before they got to where they had to work.
How did you feel when you first got here and retraced his footsteps?
It was a strange feeling. My father died when I was 5 years old, so I didn't know him at all, really. And to physically be in the place where my father was is quite an experience. "50 miles or so from Kanchanaburi, we arrive at Nam Tak, where the line now ends. From here to Burma, the track was pulled up after the war. As it happens, the area where Andrew's father worked is just a short walk away. So this is the original trace of the railway line running through to Burma.
There's no sign of it anymore, huh?
No, nothing left. But this waterfall...
It's beautiful.
Yeah, and above the waterfall here was the camp where my father was a POW.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Just a few hundred yards past the waterfall, the route of the old railway track has now become overgrown. So your research has shown this is, in fact, one of the areas your dad worked on?
Most likely, yes, it was. The men from his camp worked all through this area, so can't be precise, but somewhere along here he would have worked.
And so this was going on for hundreds of miles?
That's right, yes. There are hundreds of bridges, hundreds of cuttings, all the way through into Burma.
Were they carving it out or using dynamite or what?
Both dynamite and drills and digging. They would collect all the rubble up. They'd have a ladder set up against the side of the cutting.
Yeah.
There'd be one man here and another man up there. They'd pass a basket to one, he'd pass it to the next, and he'd throw the rubble out.
Sounds exhausting.
It was. They were working with little food, little rest, working sick, getting thrown out of hospitals to work. A lot of them had dysentery, malaria, some got cholera and died. The death toll was huge.
Do you think you could ever forgive the Japanese for what they did?
Well, that's not a problem. I don't have a problem with today's Japanese. They're not the same generation that we're talking about in World War II, and it doesn't do anything to hold a grudge against people that didn't do anything to you. So we just leave it as being that was then and this is now.
Of the 60,000 British, Australian, and Dutch POWs who worked on the Death Railway, around 12,000 died. Many of them buried here at the War Cemetery in Kanchanaburi. The prisoners of war, however, were only part of the story. It's a sobering thought that POWs actually accounted for only a small portion of the railway's terrifying death toll. More than 80,000 Asian laborers are also thought to have died working on the railway, making the overall death toll of around 100,000 men. To the southeast of Burma and Thailand, the front line of the Japanese Empire in mid-1942 ran through the middle of New Guinea and just north of Australia. Up till then, the Japanese had won every major battle of the war. But in May 1942, in the Battle of the Coral Sea, en route to invade Port Moresby, a huge Japanese fleet was attacked and forced to retreat by the U.S. aircraft carriers that had crucially survived Pearl Harbor. With the naval invasion of the strategically important Port Moresby no longer possible, in July 1942, the Japanese attacked the Australians defending it from the north, over land along the Kokoda Trail. The Kokoda campaign was fought through such remote territory that many relics of the battle have survived undisturbed until today. Matt Young treks into the mountainous highlands of central Papua New Guinea.
So what's this here?
This is a crater that was created by a Mitchell 25 bomber coming in, hitting the tops of the trees, and its impact made this hole.
It's a huge crater.
It left from Port Moresby. It was last seen through the clouds by its squadron and then never seen again.
Yeah.
There were 8 on board.
Yeah, and they all died.
And they all died. And over here, there's one part of a bomb that has exploded, but not quite. And you can see all the gunpowder in it.
Yeah. Ooh. And that's a live one, is it?
Yeah, that's a 500-pounder.
Wow, that's huge.
It's amazing to think there's an unexploded bomb lying here. Almost anywhere else in the world, it would surely have been removed by now.
And what have we got here? Oh, hand grenade.
Fuse.
Is that a hand grenade?
Yep.
Oh.
Bomb.
Yeah. Are they live?
Yeah.
They're live hand grenades.
Yeah.
That's Japanese hand grenades. You can read the Japanese writing on the top. It's not until you see the ammunition and the weapons lying around that it really sinks in what went on here.
Back in 1942, the Australians chose the high ground here at Izarava to try to hold back the pursuing Japanese. But the Japanese attacked in overwhelming numbers.
The Japanese were all over the place. They were up on that ridge up there. They were coming through that valley. They were going over this back ridge behind us, and they were coming up that gorge.
The Battle of Izarava lasted 4 days, and the 76 young Australians that died for the cause are commemorated here.
It must have been absolutely terrifying for the Australian troops knowing that Japanese soldiers were storming up on either side of the valley and surrounding them.
A few kilometres further, I get an important reminder of the suffering experienced during the war by both sides to the conflict.
Just over here, there's a Japanese war monument. It was placed here by Koshi Nishimura.
Okay.
He was a commander in the Japanese force, and he promised his men that he would come back to Papua New Guinea and take them home if they fell. He was known as the bone collector throughout PNG.
And how many men did he have to exhume?
Well, in his company, he had 55 men, including himself. He was the only survivor.
Wow.
There was a lot of Japanese men that died here, and it wasn't really acknowledged as by the Japanese people because it was known as a defeat.
After 6 months of brutal fighting, the Kokoda campaign would turn out to be the first defeat on land for the Japanese in the Pacific. More than 2,000 Australians were killed, and of the nearly 20,000 Japanese troops that fought here, it's estimated that 13,000 lost their lives.
Just 2 weeks after their defeat on the Kokoda Trail, in February 1943, the Japanese suffered another major strategic defeat, being forced by overwhelming U.S. attacks to evacuate Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. By the end of 1943, Japan's massive southern Pacific headquarters at Rabaul was being pulverized from the air. The tide of the war had turned, and the USA's increasingly superior air and sea power now forced Japan onto the defensive. Blessed by one of the Pacific's best deep-water harbors, Rabaul is a quiet backwater today. But back in World War II, it was teeming with activity. I meet up with diver Rod Pierce, whose hobby is searching for still undiscovered World War II wreckage, in particular, aeroplanes. Spectacular bay.
It is spectacular. It's surrounded by volcanoes, one of the most picturesque harbours in the world. But can you imagine this in World War II? 100,000 Japanese running around?
100,000.
Easily. You had fighters in the sky. All this harbour was full up with ships, submarines, Allied bombers coming over. It would have been a hell of a mess.
Just chaos.
Absolutely chaos.
Most of everything that happened ended up under these waters.
Yes, a lot of planes went in here, a lot of ships were sunk.
And your goal is to find them all?
I would love to find them all, but I'll find in my lifetime a very, very small portion.
Because of their size, all the World War II shipwrecks sunk beneath the waters of Rabaul Harbor have almost certainly already been found. But the relatively small size of aircraft means they're much harder to locate. To try to find them, Rod uses side-scanning sonar.
All right, this is our sonar. And if you just help me deploy this, it's very heavy.
Yep.
Because it's full of lead.
It's like a missile. So you want me to feed this to you?
You just feed that out to me. All right, so we're going to put it in now.
Okay. How deep are we putting it in?
About 10 metres. All right.
All right.
Okay, now we have it deployed and we steam ahead. This will stream out the back 20, 30 metres behind us, just off the bottom. It then paints a picture of everything, port and starboard, of us.
So it's got a camera on each side of it?
Not so much a camera, but it sends out electronic beam. It hits an object and bounces back. And then it'll paint a picture of what's down there, an aircraft, a ship. There's just so much here. It's a little boy's dream.
Yeah. To show me how the sonar works, Rod steers a course right over the top of a big Japanese ship sunk during an American bombing raid in 1943. Its location has been known for decades, but we're carrying on to anchor above a small Japanese Zero fighter plane that Rod discovered using his sonar just a few months ago.
Now we've just gone over a big Japanese wreck on our way to the Zero. So I'll show you this. This is it here.
So this side is what the left side caught,
yeah.
and this side is what the right
There's
side.
the bow.
So it's mirror images almost.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh man, look at the detail of it. It looks like a miniature picture. It's like a photo,
the detail
isn't it?
in it is phenomenal.
You even see shadows.
Shadows, masts, bow, rudder, counterlever stern. You can see it all. And now the Zero that we're going to dive.
It's small, huh? It looks like a bird just laying on the mud, huh?
Yes.
So you discovered this?
Yes.
Yeah, when?
About 6 months ago.
So really recent. That's amazing discovery.
Yeah, and only about 15 to 20 people have actually dived it.
I'm going to get to dive this.
You're going to get to dive it?
I'm feeling pretty lucky right now.
So why don't we go and do it?
I thought you'd never ask. The Zero lies on the harbor floor at a depth of around 60 feet. After crashing in the water, it came to rest upside down. Amazingly, after all these years, its rubber tires are still intact. Deep holes in its fuselage indicate that it was shot down. The water's quite murky because of all the mud and ash deposits from volcanic eruptions. But the silt does have one big benefit. It's helped preserve the paintwork that would have otherwise been washed away by sea currents. With just a little brush up, the deep red color of the Zero's rising sun markings becomes visible again after more than 60 years. "800 miles north of Rabaul, Japan's largest naval base in the South Pacific was in the Caroline Islands, at Shook Lagoon. On February 17, 1944, it too came into the firing line during Operation Hailstone, when a massive surprise attack by U.S. bombers sank 60 Japanese ships in the lagoon. Megan McCormick heads out diving.
Good morning. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine.
Shook Lagoon is 40 miles across at its widest point and accommodates 3,000 dives a year. All of the wrecks are protected as designated historical monuments.
This is the Fujikawa Maru. It's 436 feet long. She's sitting upright and she's heading east. The bow is faced this way.
The bow is this way,
yes. Yeah? Facing east, that's east.
Is it all pretty much intact?
Yes, pretty much intact. She has a bow gun and a stern gun, and she has 5 cargo holds.
Okay. The Fujikawa was a cargo ship that got torpedoed earlier in the war and was sunk in the lagoon during Operation Hailstone. There's a bow gun on deck, which is used as a cleaning station by wrasse fish. A sake bottle stands as a testament to the past. Tube corals and sea anemones cover the bow of the ship. The passageways are overgrown with whips and soft coral trees. Many dive sites have plaques to identify the different wrecks. "100 U.S. planes descended upon the lagoon on that fateful February morning in 1944. 22 U.S. aircraft were lost, such as this bomber, which crashed short of the runway and now lies some 60 feet under. Almost all the contents have been removed, but a toilet still sits conveniently in the sand. A door has been taken away to enable divers to enter the cockpit.
Also in early 1944, U.S. Marines launched the successful seaborne invasion of the Marshall Islands. In the push north to defeat Japan, the bloody reconquest of the islands the Japanese had taken after Pearl Harbor was vital. But to avoid unnecessary deaths in capturing all of them, the U.S. pursued an island-hopping strategy. In the Marshall Islands, for example, strategically important Majuro, Kwajalein, and Eniwetok were invaded by the Marines, but other islands like Mili were simply bombed into submission and bypassed en route to Japan. I'm being given a tour of the small and very remote island of Mili by Matt Hawley, a locally based American diver whose hobby is trying to find previously unknown World War II wrecks.
You imagine this during World War II as a black and white picture. No trees. Imagine no green in your view. That's what it looked like in September 1945.
Why was that?
They bombed everything flat. Don't crash. Thank you.
This is so beautiful here. It's ridiculously beautiful.
Almost as soon as we're off the boat, there's evidence of the ferocious American firepower that once rained down on Mili.
Quite a hole.
Yeah. This is about a 2,000-pound bomb crater, this area.
This is from one bomb?
This is from one bomb.
Wow.
So you've got about 40 feet by 30 feet by however deep this is, another 10 or 12 feet deep.
The Japanese didn't stand a chance.
Not since there's thousands of craters like this on Mili.
You're finding these all over the island?
Thousands of them.
So it was just like raining bombs for these guys.
They bombed them daily.
Why?
The Americans knew there was 5,000 Japanese here. They knew that if they invaded, they'd lose 1,000 men trying to kill those 5,000 Japanese. So they made a decision to bomb them daily until the end of the war.
Earlier in the war, the Japanese had had a big air base here on Mili, but after just a few weeks of the U.S. bombing campaign, it was rendered completely unusable. Just off the old airstrip, you can still see the wreckage of one of the Japanese planes.
This is a Japanese Betty bomber.
What's a Betty bomber?
A Betty bomber is a Japanese medium bomber. Had 2 engines, crew of 5 or 6, and it was designed to go out in the ocean and search for American ships and such. There used to be a big turnaround pad here that probably belonged to the commander of the air base. So this is probably his personal plane.
So it was just parked
here?
here?
So it was parked here and the Americans came in and caught it on the ground and hammered it.
Probably wasn't shot out of the air then?
No, this was not shot out of the air. This one was bombed here. That's why we've got this big bomb crater in the foreground. So we'd fly from the Gilbert Islands, bomb Mili, go to Majuro, refuel, rearm, come back, bomb it again.
How many a day would you say?
Probably a squadron, 16 in the morning and 16 in the afternoon.
Jeez, that's ruthless.
Although the American bombers ruled the sky above Mili almost unopposed, very occasionally the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners had some success. On January 19, 1944, a B-25 was shot down, crashing in the lagoon just offshore. Its location was lost for well over half a century, until Matt discovered it after years of searching.
How did you find this thing? This has got to be like finding a needle in a haystack.
The reference point in the past was a shipwreck over here, about 800 yards.
Okay.
And the military report said they crashed next to the shipwreck. So we started our search there years ago, couldn't find it. So we'd come back every year and do another block of pattern, another block of pattern, another block of pattern. On the 12th year, we found it here.
Was it just like finding gold when you found it?
Yeah, actually it was really surprising. It was like, I didn't expect it almost to find it intact. So finding an intact B-25 is very rare because when they crash, they usually turn into a bunch of debris.
Well, I can't wait to see this. I can't believe you found it. And not too many people know about this,
No,
huh?
this is only the 4th dive on this aircraft.
Wow.
The B-25 bomber lies in just 35 feet of water and is remarkably intact. In the cockpit, you can still see the steering wheel, flight control handles, and firing sight. There's even some ammunition, too. Up on top of the bomber, the turret guns are still in position. Nearby, you can see exactly where it was hit by the anti-aircraft fire that downed it. Looking into the fuselage through the shrapnel hole, I see that the bomber makes a good hiding spot for marine life. Time to leave. Elsewhere in the South Pacific, many other isolated Japanese garrisons, such as that on Palau, were also being bombed relentlessly by the US. Hopelessly cut off, the Japanese hunkered down in their bunkers and dreamed of the home that most of them would never see again. Megan McCormick flies in to visit Palau.
Megan, come on. We're almost there. You can tell by these bottles.
The bottles? Why?
Japanese were into the sake. At one time, there were about 20 of them stationed. They were very lonely out here, preparing themselves for the ultimate battle. Brought you here because I wanted to show you this very unique, camouflaged Japanese pillbox. There you go.
Thank you.
Take this.
This pillbox is one of the most impressive Japanese relics to be found on the islands.
Up ahead, right in front of us on this wall, there's some messages. Mother and father, I miss my homeland. I miss you all. When will I see your faces again? They were really stuck out here. Basically, he was at peace with himself. He's already made up his mind that he was gonna die. Yeah. To him, to die for the emperor was the greatest sacrifice.
By mid-1944, the U.S. Marines were close to getting American bombers within striking range of Japan itself. The island of Saipan, just 1,500 miles south of Tokyo, was the next invasion target. The capture of its airfields would finally allow America's fearsome long-range B-29 bombers to easily attack Japan. Knowing its capture would result in the devastation of Japan, Saipan's defenders fought ferociously, almost to the last man. To find out more about this critical battle, I'm in Saipan.
On June 15, 1944, a massive invasion force landed here on Saipan at this stretch of beach. Under very heavy fire, nearly 1,000 amphibious tractors crossed the coral reef and put ashore 20,000 U.S. Marines within the first hour of attack. The beachhead was captured successfully, but at the cost of nearly 2,000 American lives. Remarkably, after all these years, some of the relics of this battle are still out there.
Marooned offshore are 3 American Sherman tanks, which became stranded under heavy fire during the invasion. I swim out to one of them for a closer look.
So bizarre. It's really eerie. It's like I'm at a grave site of somebody. And this thing looks so strong, yet not strong enough for the coral. It got stuck in the reef. You know, from the shore, I actually feel bad for the defenders, but here, I feel bad for these guys. There's just nothing pretty about it from either side. Imagine all the firing going on, coming right at you. You gotta come out. You're just doomed.
As it happens, today is Memorial Day, when the USA honors its war dead all across the world. Here on Saipan, around 3,000 Americans were killed during the 3 weeks or so that it took to capture the island.
On this day, we celebrate courage, we celebrate dedication, and we celebrate selfless sacrifice.
On the Japanese side, the death toll was truly appalling. Despite being outnumbered and massively outgunned, they refused to surrender. At the end of the battle, less than 1,000 of the 30,000 Japanese defenders were left alive.
Ooh, it's really weird. I've been to a lot of these ceremonies throughout my life, but just having come from the tank off the shore there, it's really hit me hard. Seeing the graves, seeing the families, it doesn't just affect the soldiers, it's affecting everybody. It makes me appreciate the freedom that I have. It doesn't come for free.
After the ceremony, I head into the hills with local historian Don Farrell to find out more about the tragic story of Saipan's doomed Japanese defenders.
What I want to show you is right in here.
We're going in, huh?
Yeah. This is what I brought you up here to see, Zay.
And what happened here?
These are prayer sticks. Obviously, there's been a large group of Japanese visitors. Each one of these is different. Each one of them is an individual prayer. In Japan, before this person left, they went to a prayer stick writer, right, and told the story of their grandfather or their great-grandfather, whomever was lost here in the battle for Saipan, and had a personalized prayer written for them, and they brought it all the way with them from Japan. And then they leave them at a place where they thought that their loved one may have been lost in the battle. And that's what all of these symbolize.
Like in loving memory of, but personal prayers on it.
In our way, it's in loving memory.
So they were losing the war, they're hiding out here.
More or less. General Saito was farther back up here in the hill. He was the commanding officer of all military troops on Saipan, all army troops on Saipan, and he had concluded that they could no longer fight effectively. There were 50,000 American infantrymen, both Army and Marine Corps, on the island. He only had 4,000 or 5,000 men left. They were running out of ammunition. Many of the men didn't have guns left anymore. And so, rather than surrender, which they could not do according to their ethical code, their moral code, they joined together for this last great battle. They knew that once these islands were captured, the B-29s would come and their homeland would be under attack, and their mothers and their fathers and their sisters would be killed at home. And so they gave their final effort here to try to prevent that or delay it long enough to where perhaps their fellow soldiers on Iwo Jima and Okinawa and even the homeland of Japan might be able to force the Americans into accepting a conditional surrender rather than an unconditional surrender. So they fought to the end. And at the sound of a bugle, 3,000 men, at least 3,000 surviving Japanese, whether they had a machine gun or a pistol or a bamboo stick with a knife on the end of it or a saber, stood up and yelled, "Banzai!" And down through this valley, this gulch, knowing that they were going to die, they made their way in the darkness of night down to the beach at Tanapeg, not far from here, where they conducted a very successful last banzai. They caught the 27th Infantry Division essentially asleep at their weapons and overran them and killed hundreds of Americans before the Marines came to their rescue and were able to fight back the banzai charge. But over 3,000 Japanese died that one morning in one of the great military tragedies of the war.
Just a few miles away, we head on to where one of the great civilian tragedies of the war took place, Banzai Cliffs. Because Saipan had been a Japanese colony before the war, it had a big Japanese civilian population.
What happened here in a way, defies description. It is unbelievable what happened here in modern terms. The battle started in the south, and the civilians moved ahead of the military battle, always hoping, of course, that their side would win. Well, when the last banzai was over, and they knew that the Marines were coming, and that they were going to be captured, they believed the propaganda that had been fed to them for so many years, that these Marines would, after they captured them, torture them, kill them, rape the women, murder them all, and eat their babies. And they actually came to believe it, see. All along the cliff line here, all the way around the area, civilians walked right up to the edge and jumped to their deaths right here. Women, mothers holding their babies, fathers and mothers and children holding hands and jumping. Thousands of them. So many that the men who were driving the small American craft that came up here and saw this horror taking place said that there were so many bodies in the water it actually clogged the propellers of their craft. And the Americans were in shock seeing hundreds of babies and women in their kimonos floating in the water down there.
Sickening. It's a different kind of mentality, isn't it?
Totally different. No less than 5,000 people died right here at their own hand.
Saipan's shocking civilian deaths and suicidal banzai charges were a harbinger of even worse to come, as Japan's defeat became increasingly inevitable. By March 1945, the USA had recaptured the Philippines and taken Iwo Jima too. The next invasion target in April 1945 was part of Japan itself, Okinawa. As a huge fleet of 1,500 U.S. warships gathered offshore to support the invasion, they were attacked by Japan's last desperate suicidal weapon, kamikaze. Well over 1,000 kamikaze planes and their pilots were shot down off Okinawa. But those that got through successfully sank over 20 U.S. ships and damaged hundreds of others. Despite the kamikaze, the invasion of Okinawa did go ahead as planned, and it was eventually captured after a horrendously bloody 3-month-long battle. Ian Wright is in Okinawa to find out more.
Towards the end of the battle for Okinawa, the Japanese Navy built a secret underground headquarters from which to direct the fighting. By hand, they dug out over a mile of tunnels. These tunnels were to become their grave and the site of one of the biggest mass suicides ever known.
How long ago was this built?
This was built in 1944.
How did they build it?
It was actually carved out of stone. Most of the finer points were carved out using pickaxes.
Yeah.
This was actually the medical room where the wounded soldiers would come and receive treatment. And a lot of people came here.
You can't cram anyone in there, can you?
Pretty bloody. What was done in the tunnels, the Japanese didn't want to lose face and be captured alive, so what they did was they committed suicide here.
In here?
Yeah, in the tunnels.
Jeez.
You can actually see along the walls remnants of grenades. The Japanese either disemboweled themselves or they just threw a grenade. You can see there's some markings on the wall.
Jeez, how many was that then?
There were about 4,000 Japanese who committed suicide here. Yeah. It actually took the American military about 2 or 3 weeks after the battle was ended before they found the underground quarters here.
What, so the battle was over and then they discovered the tunnels?
Sure.
The battle for Okinawa was one of the most tragic episodes of the war. It wasn't just military personnel who died, there were heavy civilian losses as well.
When the Japanese realised they'd lost the battle for Okinawa, many civilians also committed suicide rather than be captured by the US Army, what they considered to be barbarians. And this is where they jumped to their death.
As a result of the Japanese policy of no surrender despite inevitable defeat, around 12,500 Americans and as many as 200,000 Japanese died during the battle for Okinawa. After Okinawa, the next invasion target was the heartland of Japan itself and the capital, Tokyo. But given the huge death toll on Okinawa and on other small islands like Saipan and nearby Tinian, it was clear that an invasion of heavily populated Japan would involve horrendous bloodshed on both sides. Although conventional bombing of Japan's cities was killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, there was no surrender in sight. And so the fateful decision was taken to use a terrifying new weapon that had just been invented. I'm at the now disused World War II airstrip on the island of Tinian near Saipan, where in August 1945, both of the planes took off that dropped atomic bombs on Japan.
The two atom bombs were so big they couldn't be loaded onto the bombers in their normal way. They had to be hoisted up from this pit right here. The plane carrying the first bomb, the Enola Gay, took off from that runway right there on the 6th of August, 1945, bound for Hiroshima, and within just a few hours had changed the world forever.
Over 80,000 people in Hiroshima were killed instantly by the nuclear explosion, and just as many more died from radiation sickness in the weeks that followed. Amazingly, however, Japan still didn't surrender, and so 3 days later, a second plane took off from Tinian with yet another atom bomb, this time dropping it on Nagasaki. Ian Wright visits the Peace Museum in Nagasaki, dedicated to the memory of those who died in the nuclear explosion.
It exploded in the air,
Right.
500 meters above the ground.
Right. Was it right in the center?
No, exploded in the suburbs area. That's why the number of the victims was smaller than that of in Hiroshima.
Right. What was the number of victims?
74,000 people were killed instantly, and another 75,000 people were injured. The surface temperature of the bomb was 7,000 degrees centigrade.
Yeah.
If you compare the degree with the surface temperature of the sun, it is 6,000 degrees centigrade. So the fireball was more than the surface temperature of the sun.
Hideko Yoshiyama was one of the lucky survivors.
When I looked out from the window, I saw nothing. Everything that existed before the bombing disappeared. I saw many burnt bodies. I also saw a mother and a child. The mother died, but the child was alive under the mother's body. The bodies looked very soft. If I pushed the body, I thought I could break the body, so it was awful. I cannot explain, but it was just hell.
Persuaded at last that further resistance was futile, Japan surrendered unconditionally just a few days later. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor that had launched the Pacific War nearly 4 years earlier, millions had been killed by the Japanese aggressors. Over 100,000 U.S. servicemen alone had died fighting in the Pacific, and Japanese deaths amounted to around 2 million military and 1 million civilians. The Second World War in the Pacific was over, but the entire region had been laid to waste. It would take decades to recover.